the idea that you are going to peel Russia away to the extent that it makes a huge difference, when the Russian and Chinese objective is the reformatting of the world order led by the US to a degree that benefits them more, suggests that the idea that the Russians are going to give that up is a nonsense.
Hello and welcome to Frontline, Times Radio's interview series about the war in Ukraine and global security. I'm James Hansen, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Matthew Savill, Director of Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute. Matthew, it's always a pleasure. Welcome back to Frontline.
Good afternoon.
Now, we have so much to discuss. It's been an incredibly eventful few days when it comes to the war in Ukraine. Obviously, on Friday, we had those remarkable scenes in the Oval Office between Zelensky, Trump and J.D. Vance. Then on Saturday, Zelensky was welcomed by Keir Starmer and embraced by him in Downing Street. And then yesterday, Sunday, in London, we saw a gathering of European leaders and the Prime Minister of Canada in London to agree a way forward. On top of that, we've seen Russia continuing to bombard Ukrainian towns and cities, including notably Kharkiv overnight, and there's even talk of a potential truce. Now, we'll get into all those in detail in due course, but I suppose, first and foremost, have things fundamentally shifted over the last few days?
Thank you. I was thinking about this just before this call, and I am not sure as to the extent to which things have fundamentally shifted, but some things are clearer. And we can dig into this, but for example, President Trump and the US, I think their skepticism towards Ukraine, it has been on full display. And we thought that might be the case before. And when we spoke last year, we talked about the possibility that there was a slim chance the Ukrainians could maybe convince them to reinvest and back them. But I think last week just showed that there is a degree of personal animus lurking beneath the surface. There are links to a lot of, if you like, long-running sores in the Trump administration, and they are, broadly speaking, not hugely invested in this war, or at least in prolonging it. So that's a thing we suspected before. It feels like it's a lot more certain now. Secondly, I think we have seen Europe attempting to, if you like, buy its way into the ceasefire talks. And I think there's been a lot of diplomatic effort over the last week, and I think the UK will be reflecting on what appears to have been an incredible amount of activity, some of it successful. But we aren't hugely further forward on actually turning that into material support yet. And then finally, we have the situation on the ground, which appears to be slowly, if you like, kind of grinding forwards, and not radical changes, but there are, interesting backwards and forwards. So I think if you were already inclined to think that the US was not wildly invested in this, and that there was a change in the US attitude towards European security, you would say this week is not a fundamental change. I think if you were still in what some might call denial, and it's business as normal, but just a bit tougher, I think you would be somewhat more shocked.
How essential are the US to any long-term deal to ensure Ukraine security? Could Europe do it by itself?
I mean, those are two different questions because they depend on when you answer it. And in the first case, the US is essential now because it does not provide the majority of military support, but it is the single largest contributor. It is the thing that underpins NATO military power, and it provides a lot of the more sophisticated or niche systems, as well as, we understand, considerable intelligence and other support. So if you take away the US support at the moment, Europe is not in a position to substitute in one for one, like for like. In the medium to longer term, Europe has the financial power, if it chooses to do so, to cover a lot of the gaps. But it can't do so in the next 12 months, say. And it's going to be some time before it can step up. And that's because it's, if you like, it's lagging in its start. And what that means is Ukraine is still in this window of vulnerability. I saw it heard described the other day that both sides are losing, but Russia is losing less slowly. And the issue is not that this is an inevitable defeat for Ukraine if its backers continued to back it and did more. It's that at the moment, the personnel problems, that attritional warfare is exacting a higher toll on Ukraine and making the situation less favorable for it every day.
Do you think that explains why, despite the disgraceful treatment of Zelensky by Trump and Vance in the Oval Office on Friday, Zelensky said last night he is still open to this US minerals deal because he probably recognizes that it's the best form of security guarantee he will get from the US. And Trump's argument would be, if you have American contractors on the ground, it may not be a formal security guarantee, but it offers some kind of protection for them.
Yeah, we need to pick that apart a little bit. I mean, I think the way that the minerals deal was being expressed in terms of the details that emerged just over a week ago, it was very unfavorable to Ukraine. It was, give us lots of money now, if you're the US, for things that we've already done, and we won't provide you with any security guarantees, but hey, we'll see what we can do. It sounds like the Ukrainians negotiated it down to the promise of future exploitation of minerals without the big upfront payment and still no security guarantees, which is a problem because it doesn't really provide you with much comfort, but at least you're still being extorted, but at least you're not paying a vast sum for the privilege of having a discussion. I think he is returning to it, possibly because behind the scenes the UK is encouraging him to do so. And this is one area where the past week, if you were to look at the more significant change, it would be the fact that the US position was on full display and the nature of the bust-up last week makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to continue without trying to mend bridges. And that will be a bitter pill to swallow. I'm not sure they're going to be very comfortable about it, obviously. But they do need to do something. I think he is essentially trying to reset that in a way that is emollient, but ideally doesn't involve him doing too much public apologizing. He has a domestic constituency to appeal to. He has an audience in Europe and in Russia that he needs to project some kind of strength to. And in that respect, the events over the weekend with European countries and Canada rallying round to a degree is an important boost to him.
And is that argument that the presence of US contractors on the ground exploiting Ukraine's mineral resources would deter Putin? Is that a valid argument in your view? Would it be a deterrent?
I understand why it's why it's an argument that is being made. I'm not sure if I'm convinced. I believe I've seen some claims from the media, people going back to 2022, that there were tens of thousands of US civilians, contractors, businessmen in Ukraine at the time of the invasion. And that played no role in seriously influencing the Russian decision to invade. Putting people working on exploitation in the country might complicate Russian decision making. But I can't help but feel if the situation ramped up as tensions went up, it would be inevitable that the travel advice or the advice of their companies or their insurance would be, you need to leave the country. And if needs be, the US would conduct what is known as a non-combatant evacuation operation, a NEO, and it would get them out or encourage them to make their own way out. They're not going to stand around and willingly be the tethered goat as a Russian combined arms army rolls towards them. I think that's pretty fanciful that would happen deliberately. And in any case, if there's a resumption of violence, I think the suspicion at the moment would be that the Trump administration, at least, would blame it on the Ukrainians.
And so Vladimir Putin thinks that there is no scenario probably in which if he were to move again on Ukraine, and yes, there are American contractors on the ground, he thinks, well, Donald Trump's not going to deploy US troops to protect them.
I think there would need to be an awful lot of signaling to convince Putin otherwise, because if you were guessing now, you wouldn't believe that. And in fact, I think Putin has shown he is prepared to take risks and gamble, the big picture is that his gamble on Ukraine is not necessarily paying off at the moment. But he took that risk. There is now sunk costs involved. They still haven't achieved their main goal. It is difficult to see that the presence of a few thousand contractors in country would really change things. And this is where we get into this Trump unpredictability argument. He's unpredictable. That deters his adversaries. I think the problem is if your messaging is inconsistent and your adversary is a risk taker, they tend to lean the other way, or they might lean the other way, and gamble that they can get away with it, that Trump's mercurial nature will play out differently. Now, if this were not Ukraine, maybe that calculation would be different. But he has so clearly signaled that he is not interested in a conflict with Russia over Ukraine. So what is it that the US would do to change that perception in advance of any future Russian invasion?
I was watching an archive interview with the late John McCain over the weekend from about 10 years ago, and he made the point nothing provokes Vladimir Putin like weakness. Now, if you're Donald Trump, you think you are being the strong man here. You think you are saying hard truths that need to be heard in Kyiv, and you think you're being tough by trying to force through a deal. But in actual fact, is he projecting American weakness, and will that provoke Vladimir Putin?
I think they would reject the idea of American weakness. I think they are giving the Russians an opportunity, and they are insufficiently constraining them. I think, to be fair to the administration, what they would say is that they are taking a cold look at US priorities. That their view is that this is not a priority. This is a European problem where the Europeans should take the lead. They have invested too much as America already, and frankly, they have bigger fish to fry, and that bigger fish is China. And frankly, there's a degree of irritation that they think that they have been entangled in this by, in their telling, weak Europeans and a duplicitous Ukrainian government. I mean, that would be the narrative, and you can see it in the way that people like J.D. Vance and others talk about this. So I think they are being far too lenient and giving opportunities to Russia, but they would argue this is a question of just choosing to reallocate US resources, and everybody else needs to get with the program.
I've also heard the argument advanced, Matthew, and I don't know what you make of this, that the big picture here is obviously US foreign policy is reorientating towards China and focusing on the threat of China long term. And this is Donald Trump's attempt by rebuilding relations with Russia to peel Vladimir Putin away from Xi Jinping. Is that how you see it?
Well, I think that's what they have said in the past week is their attempt. If I'm honest, I think that is fanciful. The idea that you are going to peel Russia away to the extent that it makes a huge difference when the Russian and Chinese objective is the reformatting of the world order led by the US to a degree that benefits them more, suggests that the idea that the Russians are going to give that up is a nonsense. You might attempt to introduce friction, but if they're being just as transactional as you, then China and Russia have this relationship where Chinese support has made a material difference to what they are able to do. And the only way to counter that is if you're prepared to somehow engage at a higher level of economic interaction. If we're living in a world where the US economically is essentially boosting Russia in order to outcompete China, I think we're in a deeply disturbing place. So I just don't find that argument, as explained, particularly convincing, to the extent that I have to wonder whether they really, really mean that. But they have said it. It's just not very credible.
I wanted to get your reaction, Matthew, to the 4-point plan that was agreed by the world leaders in London yesterday. Number 1, keep military aid flowing into Ukraine and keep increasing the economic pressure on Russia. Number 2, that Ukraine must be present at any peace talks and that any lasting peace must ensure the country's sovereignty and security. 3, in the event of any peace deal, Ukraine's defensive capabilities must be boosted to deter any future invasion. And number 4, to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee peace afterwards. Are those 4 points achievable?
So I think the first 3 points there are essentially a continuation of the existing policy. And there's a question as to whether or not they're going to put in more to make them achievable, particularly if we think there's going to be reduced US support. The last one is interesting because it's the biggest gamble, and it's the one that comes with the greatest risk of a split within Europe. Only a handful of countries have put their heads above the parapet so far in terms of supporting supporting this idea of deploying a force in, even if it's after a ceasefire, and that will have to be led by France and the UK. The problem is that there is precious little chance, not no chance, but little chance, of the US providing the kind of security guarantees, or rather the backstop to this security guarantee to make it feasible. If you remember that Defense Secretary Hegseth, about a month ago now, I guess it was, essentially ruled this out. And then since then, Trump has sounded skeptical, but he's talked as if it might be possible. And I wonder if he gave Keir Starmer and Macron some hope when they visited. But he sounds pretty skeptical, and we are back to the overall attitude of being doubtful about the US's commitment here. And so that feels like a sort of something that they are trying to throw in to get the US to pay attention to the European perspective, accompanied by, as it is, a broader commitment on European increased defense spending, which is a necessary condition to both support Ukraine and rebuild their own forces. They've been doing it for 10 years, but the level of investment at the moment, it's difficult to see that doing both things at once.
And again, I suppose the crucial question is, if you had one of these coalitions of the willing in Ukraine to defend any peace deal, let's say led by Britain and France, is that enough of a deterrent without a US backstop to prevent Vladimir Putin launching further aggression down the line?
It's really hard to know the answer to that question, so I'm going to equivocate. The way that the force is being described, they're not talking about it as a full deterrent. They're using the words reassurance force because what they are saying is they're aiming it more at the Ukrainians, demonstrating that there is a commitment and a backing from international forces. But the link that they have drawn to a US backstop, backup, the cavalry, whatever you want to call it, makes it sound like they do want it to have a deterrent effect, which is, if you come in after us, the US has our back, and now you're facing the same problem as you had before, oh Russia, which is you're beginning to fight NATO forces. So they wouldn't materially expand to a huge extent the number of personnel in country. It might be 20 or 30,000. Bear in mind the Ukrainians have got about 800,000 in their security and military forces, although only about a third of that is on the front line. But they're hoping that that gives the Russians pause for thought. I'm just not sure if it works that way, because once again, they've so closely linked it to the US, and the US has so obviously been skeptical that, again, Putin might be tempted. I wonder if I can do damage to European NATO and not suffer the consequences. And that's where broader European rearmament begins to make a difference. But that plays out over several years, not necessarily this year.
Well, this is where Putin may see this as a moment of great opportunity, because really ever since Joseph Stalin, the aim of, Soviet and then Russian foreign policy has been to disrupt the transatlantic alliance and to break up NATO. And he may think, well, this is my moment of maximum opportunity.
And this is where you get into the complexity of what would this force have? What would its mandate be? The extent of its interaction with NATO. I think everybody involved would be keen not to link it directly to NATO, because you actually wouldn't want to put Article 5 at risk for this if you're operating outside of the boundaries of existing NATO countries. There's a question of whether Article 5 can even apply. The US has basically shot down that idea already, and because you would want them to be both credible supporter of this and a material supporter, you would actually be damaging it. And you get into sort of a lot of second guessing. I think the problem for the force and its deterrent credibility is that a lot of that leverage has already been squandered or given up because of various statements made in the past couple of months. More broadly, Europe and the US have stated from the start that they're not willing to go to war with Russia in Ukraine. And I think, therefore, it's quite hard to see how you create some kind of ambiguity that might be possible in the future.
Just finally, Matthew, one of the other things that has been mooted in recent days is this idea of a 1 month long truce. The French in particular seem to be pushing this. Do you think that's viable?
I mean, it's possible, but it seems highly impractical. They would have to really work on what the terms were. I heard it described as air and sea only, but not on land. Well, what does that mean? Does that mean artillery is okay, but you can't fly drones? That would be a problem for the Ukrainians because there is still a slight artillery imbalance, whereas the Russians have got a lot of artillery still. Do you just ban various types of drones? Do you have an altitude ceiling or something like that? You start quibbling over ridiculous details, and it sounds quite complicated to enforce. How do you stop Russian cheating? What kind of observation do you have in place? So the better bet is something akin to suggestions that have been made previously about restrictions on targeting, which is, would the Russians stop attacking critical national infrastructure in return for the Ukrainians stopping striking Russian energy production or deep strike targets? The challenge there is that there is a very sound reason for the Ukrainians upping the pressure on the Russian military industrial complex, and that includes energy production. And therefore, you would be asking them to compromise one of the routes they've got to increasing the pain on Russia. So I'm sure everybody, well, a lot of people would like to see a ceasefire. The devil really will be in the details.
Matthew, we always appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us again on Frontline.
My pleasure.